out from Africa. And you can see also when they spread out, because you can use this not only to determine which group you belong to, but when the group came into existence and when it started moving. You can see how people, there's a starting, they have a common ancestor. So in this specific map, you see the different haplogroups in the world. And you can see that there's a starting point, Africa, for all of humanity. And you can see how people spread out from Africa. And you can see also when they spread out, because you can use this not only to determine which group you belong to, but when the group came into existence and when it started moving. And this is, for example, a chart of the haplogroups of non-Africans. It'll be more meaningful afterwards. The branching points are always, can be tied to one specific individual who developed a mutation, who had a lot of sons, and these sons managed to survive and have more sons. And when you take all the people living now and test them, you can create the tree that you see by going backwards. And on the left-hand side, you can see the years. It's, at the top, it's 80,000 years, then 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. The dotted line corresponds to 12,000 years ago, which is when you had a mini ice age in the region, which affected populations everywhere. So you can see that a lot of the groups that are in existence now in Western Asia, in the world, came into existence many tens of thousands of years ago. And when you take a test, you can go back that far. I am J1, for example, and J1 goes back 25,000 years. That's when the man who developed the mutations that all of the J1s in the world belong to have, that was 25,000 years ago, and J was 30,000. So this is really deep, deep, deep ancestry. And then the interesting thing, once you take that and you put people in the different groups, then you have a map of the world and you see which groups they belong to. And Africans remain to a large extent part of their own groups. Then you have one wave of migration out of Africa, which went to Southeast Asia and to Australia and New Zealand, and on to Asia and the Americas. And then you had a group of people who went a little bit later, let's say 70, 80,000 years ago, in the Middle East. And they lived there for a while, and from there they spread out. But when they spread out, it was very often one small group of people who spread out. So when you look at this map of the world, the only place in the world where you have a rainbow of colors of different groups is Western Asia and Central Asia. The rest of the world is very mono-haploid group of people who spread out. So when you look at this map of the world, the only place in the world where you have a rainbow of colors of different groups is Western Asia and Central Asia. The rest of the world is very mono-haplogroup. And I'll show you in the next slide what Europe looks like. And here in Europe, you basically have one group shown in red, which is R1b, very predominant in Western Europe, and people whose ancestors come from there. You have two groups which are typical of Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You have the Russians and the Slavs, who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. It's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it come from there. You have two groups which are typical of Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You have the Russians and the Slavs, who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. It's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it mixes a little bit, which is called R1b. The Russians and the Slavs, who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. The Russians and the Slavs, who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. It's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it mixes a little bit more. And just to illustrate how the group in yellow, which is called R1, have two groups which are typical of Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You have the Russians and the Slavs, who have the group in yellow, which is called R1b. It's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it mixes a little bit more. And just to illustrate how this works because every time it's somebody who develops a mutation, he has many sons, the sons pass that to their son, and once they start moving, that haplogroup starts moving. I'm going to talk a little bit about the European R1b haplogroup, which happens to be also the most important haplogroup in Armenians also. When you test Armenian males, 35 to 40% of them belong to this group. That it mixes a little bit more. R1b, it's only when you start getting into the Mediterranean that it mixes a little bit more. And just to illustrate how this works, because every time it's somebody who develops a mutation, he has many sons, the sons pass that to their son, and once they start moving, that haplogroup starts moving. I'm going to talk a little bit about the European R1b haplogroup, which happens to be also the most important haplogroup in Armenians. Which strains in males, 35 to 40% of them belong to this group, which strangely enough is the predominant one by far in Western Europe. So on the face of it, when you look at R1b and you look at the distribution of R1b that they came up with initially, when you see a map like this, you say, it's clear, it's something that started in Western Europe and then the people migrated towards this. You say, it's clear, it's something that started in Western Europe and then the people migrated towards the east, something that's R1b that they came up with initially. When you see a map like this, you say, it's clear, it's something that started in Western Europe initially. When you see a map like this, you say, it's clear, it's something that started in Western Europe, and then the people migrated towards the east. And you had a small cluster of these European R1bs. Are they the famed cells that were immortalized in the dying gold sculpture in Greek times? Who knows? So, but is this the reality or not? You start digging a little bit deeper, but is this the reality or not? You start digging a little bit deeper, and this is R1b worldwide. And here you see something strange. I mean, you see pockets of R1bs in Asia, in Central Asia. You have a very deep pocket in Africa. In Asia, in Central Asia. You have a very deep pocket in Africa, between Cameroon and Chad. And you start wondering, how could these people have moved around, and when did they move around? I mean, you see pockets of R1bs in Asia, in Central Asia. You have a very deep pocket in Africa, between Cameroon and Chad. And you start wondering, how could these people have moved around, and when did they move around? And by actually studying the mutations of the people who belong to these groups, you start building a tree of R1b. And when you do that, you can extrapolate and find out when this group came into existence. And it came into existence 24,000 years ago in the Altai region in Russia, because we've been able to extract ancient DNA, which is R1b, from this period. And then it stayed for a long, long time in Central Asia, in and around. And then it stayed for a long, long time in Central Asia, in and around it stayed for a long, long time in Central Asia, in and around the Armenian region to the north. It stayed for a long, long time in Central Asia, in and around the Armenian region to the north, to the east a little bit, the Caspian Sea, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And it only to the north, to the east a little bit, the Caspian Sea, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And it only started moving, if you can see, the Caspian Sea, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And it only started moving, if you can see here, 3,000 years ago, or a little bit more, into Europe. You can see here, 3,000 years ago, and it only started moving, if you can see here, 3,000 years ago, or a little bit more, into Europe. So all of 3,000 years ago, or a little bit more, into Europe. So all of these Europeans, R1bs, are recent arrivals. And now they represent up to 80 to 90% of the Celtic populations. Europeans, R1bs, are recent arrivals. And now they represent up to 80 to 90% of the Celtic populations, the Irish, the Welsh, the Breton, the Basques. But whenever we do ancient DNA studies in Europe that go beyond 4,000 to 5,000 years, we never find any R1bs. So when you do the tree of R1b, you see here, for example, that the oldest Europe that go beyond 4,000 to 5,000 years, we never find any R1bs. So when you do the tree of R1b, you see here, for example, that the oldest versions in the little map are centered around Iran and the Caspian Sea, south of the Caspian Sea. Centered around, for example, that the oldest versions in R1b, you see here, for example, that the oldest versions in the little map are centered around Iran and the Caspian Sea. South of the Caspian Sea are centered around Iran and the Caspian Sea, south of the Caspian Sea, both sides. All of the Armenians tested so far who are R1b belong to ancient parts of the tree, and all of the Europeans who belong to these two big groups, including Bernard Pouli, who's a very famous Armenian linguist living in Belgium, country where we reside, belong to some of the more younger branches, including Bernard Pouli, who's a very famous Armenian linguist living in Belgium, country where we reside, belong to some of the more younger branches. And this shows you where some of these younger European branches are located. You have a typically Celtic Atlantic group, you have an Italo-Celtic group, you have a Basque group, and then you have a Germanic group also. So all of these, this is just to show you how you can take DNA studies and the haplogroup studies and the mutations, and you tie them to specific people who lived at a specific time, and you can really date exactly when these branches came into existence. And people in Western Europe, for example, can really know now from which Irish or Celtic or Germanic tribe they came from. That's how accurate DNA testing is. So we get back to the Armenians now after this DNA testing is. So we get back to the Armenians now after this digression. But I wanted to use this to really illustrate. And I should finish that point by saying that there's a major study going on about R1b, which should come out in the next year or so. I'm not involved in it, but it's going to explain exactly where these people came from and what path they used to get into Europe, and they'll try to tie it to historical and mythological texts. When you test Armenians, this is one big surprise a little bit. We are told, test Armenians get into Europe, and they'll try to tie it to historical and mythological texts. When they use to get into Europe, and they'll try to tie it to historical and mythological texts. But I wanted to use this to really illustrate. And I should finish that point by saying that there's a major study going on about explain exactly where these people came from, mythological texts. When you test Armenians, this is one big surprise a little bit. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat, etc. The myth a little bit. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat, etc. Like an founder. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat, etc. Like an Arab tribe where he was the patriarch. But clearly, one big surprise a little bit. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat. etc., like an Arab tribe where he was the patriarch. But clearly we're not, because when you test Armenians, this is a sample of 550 male Armenians tested. You get a rainbow of different groups, and you remember that most of these groups came into existence 15, 20, 30,000 years ago. who finished on Mount Ararat, etc., like an Arab tribe where he was the patriarch. But clearly we're not, because when you test Armenians, this is a sample of 550 male Armenians tested, you get a rainbow of different. Test Armenians, this is one big surprise a little bit. We are told that we're all the descendants of Haik, the mythical founder of the Armenian nation who finished on Mount Ararat, etc., like an Arab tribe where he was the patriarch. But clearly we're not, because when you test Armenians, this is a sample of 550 male Armenians tested, you get a rainbow of different groups. And you remember that most of these groups came into existence 15, 20, 30,000 years ago, long, long before we became Armenians. So it's clear to me that years ago, long, long before we became Armenians. So it's clear to me that Armenians are a group of people who were of very different origins, who were probably living in the same place and who coalesced to become Armenians and took on the Armenian language at one point in time and have maintained their Armenianness since. Remember the chart I showed you before here with the inverted tree? Here I've put circles around the big Armenian groups. In black is the biggest group for the Armenians, R1b. You have 30% of Armenians who belong to that. In red, it's the next three biggest groups. In blue, you have three, and in green, it's small groups that represent 1% and 4%. You see that most of these came into existence 15, 20, 25, 30,000 years ago. So we're clearly not all the descendants of the same founder. Clearly not came into existence 15, 20, 25, 30,000 years ago. So we're clearly not all the descendants of the same founder of the Armenian nation. And furthermore, I'm going to go through these very quickly. Once you look at, when I say I'm J1, there are many flavors of J1. Levon is R1a, there are many flavors of R1a. And sometimes you find in certain people only one flavor. And in Armenians, you find very often many flavors. Each of these lines here represents a different flavor of a specific group. I'll go through those slides very quickly, just to show you that not only do we belong to ancient groups, but they had already branched out a long time ago, and we belong to many of those branches. When you compare, I'll talk about Armenians and Georgians later. Now, a question you can ask yourself once you know which groups Armenians belong to and when you can date when these groups came into existence, are they autochthonous or not? I can't expect you to read the small print here, but when you dig into this and you separate what is autochthonous and what is not, you realize that 80% to 85% of the branches to which Armenians belong came into existence in the area in which we live. So for me, it's relatively clear evidence that we are mainly an autochthonous population, that few Armenians came from elsewhere, but only ancient DNA will prove that. Here it's just conjecture. By branches to which Armenians belong came into existence in the area in which we live. Armenians belong came into existence, percent to 85% of the branches to which Armenians belong came into existence in the area in which we live. So for me, it's relatively clear evidence that we are mainly an autochthonous population, that few Armenians came from elsewhere, but only ancient DNA will few Armenians came from elsewhere, but only ancient DNA will prove that. Here it's just conjecture by comparing to other populations of the world. And because of our location and because of a lot of the European, Central Asian, and let's say Southeast Asian groups radiated from this area, the study of Armenian DNA is very interesting to people who study DNA of other people, because to them we are like an image of what the DNA groups were before they started spreading out. So our project and Armenian DNA in general is very, very interesting to people who study the subject. So here I think I can answer some of the questions I had asked before. As mentioned, can we define an Armenian genetically? Definitely not, because we have very, very varied ancestry. We are clearly people who have had deep, deep, deep roots in the region, which makes the tragedy of our scattering even more tragic, sadly. We'd managed to stay there for a long, long time, and now we've been scattered a little bit all over the world. Who have had deep, deep, deep roots in the region, which makes the tragedy of our scattering even more tragic, sadly. We'd managed to stay there for a long, long time, and now we've been scattered a little bit all over the world. But strangely enough, despite the fact that we are very varied origins, ever since we became Armenians, linguistically, culturally, religiously, we've managed to remain relatively stable because this proportion of haplogroups hasn't really changed, and we have not mixed with other populations. It's one of the questions I had asked before. When you look at Armenians living now to see if there is evidence of Arab invasions, Turkish invasions, Mongol invasions, you rarely find any trace of this in Armenian DNA, which is not what I was expecting, but Turkish invasions, Mongol invasions, you rarely find any trace of this in Armenian DNA, which is not what I was expecting, but it's how it turned out to be. Some maps to show you. I showed you before the distribution of R1b, which is the most important groups for Armenians. This is the second most important group. Armenians belong to it, but so do most of the people in the Middle East and in Southern Europe, in Turkey and Greece, Italy. This is a group which is clear but so do most of the people in the Middle East and in Southern Europe, in Turkey and Greece, Italy. This is a group which is clearly associated by the people who invented agriculture, who laid out the first cities, who invented the first alphabet, and then spread out with their inventions in Europe. In Europe now they're finding out that the people who invented agriculture and all these things, who came over from the Middle East, basically did not transmit a knowledge which was taken by locals. They came with their knowledge and they replaced the people who were living there. You can really see that when you do ancient DNA. My own group, J1, was taken by locals. They came with their knowledge and they replaced the people who were living there. You can really see that when you do ancient DNA. My own group, J1, is more tied to pastoralists and is found in the highest concentrations in the Dagestan regions. Some researchers believe that it came originally from the Armenian highlands. It happens to be one of the most important group in the Arab population, and also in a lot. My own group, J1, is more tied to pastoralists and is found in the highest concentrations in the Dagestan regions. Some researchers believe that it came originally from the Armenian highlands. It happens to be one of the most important group in the Arab population, and also in a large chunk of the Jewish population also. But here, as with the other groups, you can see the different branching outs, where it started, how it spread. This is how we use these tools to see how people move over the years. G is the same thing. It's a very, very majority group now in Georgia and in Ossetia, but when you study majority years, G is the same thing. It's a very, very majority group now in Georgia and in Ossetia, but when you study the origin of G, you see that it started in the Armenian highlands, and the Georgian version of G is a newer one, and it's much more concentrated than what you find in the Armenian population. So here again, it's proof to a certain extent that some of those important European, West Asian groups saw their beginnings in the region in which we come from. The broad region, of course, which includes some areas where Armenians have never lived but are nearby. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering what DNA has to say about linguistics. The answer is nothing, sadly, because you can't deduce from the genes and genetics what somebody spoke, and you know how easily it is for somebody to lose a language and acquire a new one. How easily it is for somebody to lose a language and acquire a new one. With how easily it is for somebody to lose a language and acquire a new one. how easily it is for somebody to lose a language and acquire a new one within a span of a very, very few generations. There are many theories as to the origin of Indo-European languages. Armenians speak an Indo-European language. Some people say it started a long, long time ago in the Armenian highlands. Some people claim that it started in the steppes of Russia further to the north, and that it came to Armenia by way of the Balkans. DNA doesn't really help us on all this, but it can help prove or disprove certain theories. I mean, if we're very similar to people who speak different languages, people who live in the Caucasus and speak North Caucasian languages, people who speak Semitic languages, Assyrians, it's probably languages, people who speak Semitic languages, live in the Caucasus and speak North Caucasian languages, people who speak Semitic languages, Assyrians, it's probably an indication that the Armenians who belonged to such a rainbow of different haplogroups spoke a myriad of languages. That I can certify that Armenians spoke many, many, many different languages before they adopted Armenian. How did they come to adopt Armenian? When did it start? When did it become the language rather than the other languages they spoke? Where did it come from? These are questions that linguists will have to answer, and we'll see if DNA can help them a little bit or not. R1A is another interesting group, a minor group in Armenians, which is divided, when you look at it, into Indo-Iranian speakers and Slavic speakers. And initially, I thought that many Armenians would belong to this if it was true that we came from the Balkans initially, but it's a very minor percentage of Armenians who belong to this group, and we initially didn't know which, the few Armenians are on R1A, which part they belong to, but thanks to genetic studies and mutations, we were able to divide the Armenians. 2/3 of the Armenian R1As are clearly of Indo-Iranian background. They were perhaps descendants of Iranians who lived in our region for a while, or it was older than that. And 1/3 of them come from a pre-Slavic branch, including Levon, whom you can see here. And you can see that this shows you how when you study mutations, you can really narrow it down to specific people in a specific place, and you can really date all of these things. So Levon's branch came into existence 3,500 years ago. You have a lot of Slavs and Balts who belong to that, but he belongs to one of the branches, the older branches. Same thing for this group. I will pass very quickly. I'll mention very quickly these two group branches. You have a lot of Levon's branch came into existence 3,500 years ago. These things, specific people in a specific place, and you can really date all of these things. So Levon's branch came into existence 3,500 years ago. You have a lot of Slavs and Balts who belong to that, but he belongs to one of the branches, the older branches. 3,500 years ago, you have a lot of Slavs and Balts who belong to that, but he belongs to one of the branches, the older branches. Mutations, you can really narrow it down to specific people in a specific place, and you can really date all of these things. So Levon's branch came into existence 3,500 years ago. You have a lot of Slavs and Balts who belong to that, but he belongs to one of the branches, the older branches. Same thing for this group. I will pass very quickly. I'll mention very quickly these two groups which are found in the I1 flavor in the Nordic countries and in the I2 flavor in the Slavic countries. There's a small group of Armenians who belong to this, and Hovan has researched them for the purpose of his talk, because there's a specific group of Armenians who belong to this interesting group, and you can see them in red in the and they have a very strange distribution, and we need to determine where these people came from. I mentioned earlier that we were very close to the neighboring populations when you look at our overall DNA. But when you plot the Y-DNA of men, for example, this shows you Armenians in red and Assyrians in blue. And when you plot who is A, who is J, who is J2, R1B, you get almost the same distribution, which is mind-blowing and shows you that initially we were the same people who ended up belonging to different religious groups and speaking different languages. You can do that belonging to different religious groups, the same people, which is mind-blowing and shows you that initially we were the same people who ended up belonging to different religious groups and speaking different languages. You can do that with Armenia. It shows you that initially we were the same people who ended up belonging to different religious groups and speaking different languages.
Israel, out of all of the white nations in the world?
Well, it's fairly obvious, because what's happening now is what happened in 1991. And remember, I deal in long-term patterns. That's what the Iceman inheritance is all about. And now I see, as Yogi Berra would have put it, it's deja vu all over again. In 1991, the elder Mr. Bush goes to war in Desert Storm against Iraq on not only the flimsiest of pretexts, but what turns out to be trumped-up pretexts. And then 10 years later, his son does the same thing. Who is the enemy? In both cases, it's Israel's enemy. So whereas bin Laden didn't have a whole lot to gain from this terrorist attack, as we see right now, Israel did.
What did Israel get to gain?
Well, I think you see it. It's American power directed against Israel's enemies: Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria. The Americans are not ruling out action in all these countries. Rumsfeld has said, Afghanistan, Syria, against Israel's enemies: Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria. The Americans are not ruling out action in all these countries. Rumsfeld has said continually, we're not ruling out action in other countries.
History, since you say you have a long memory in history, let's identify what you have discussed in your Iceman's inheritance, the prehistoric sources of Western man's racism, sexism, and aggression. Now, historically, how do you identify of Western man's racism, sexism, and aggression? Now, historically, how do you identify the white man as, or Western man's racism, sexism, and aggression? How did that come to be?
Well, it came to be this way. First of all, I know it seems an awful long time, but it's still quite current. About 100,000 years ago, there were various groups of men, and they were all pretty well the same. They were highly aggressive, but they had all developed, insofar as we know, from skeletal evidence and other sources, what's called aggression displacement mechanisms. Evidence and other sources, what's called aggression displacement mechanisms. They were aggressive, but they had sexual mechanisms to absorb that aggression. Then what happened, and it happened only in Europe and Western Asia, was that one group of these people suddenly had to adapt to a glacial environment. And when they did, the things they needed to survive in a glacial environment sort of overlapped or nullified or superimposed themselves upon these sexual adaptations which had been made to absorb aggression. For instance, the Western man during the last ice age became much hairier than other groups of people in the interest of warmth. But there's various other adaptations of the same sort. Okay, these partially erased or nullified previous adaptations which were designed to absorb aggression. So not having those adaptations in any really vital way, they became more aggressive because more of their aggression was manifested outward. It wasn't absorbed. It's as simple as that.
It wasn't absorbed?
Not as much as with other groups of mankind. So it was therefore manifested afterwards, outwards, and that leads to your conquest, your expansion, and all this kind of thing, your aggression, manifested outward.
So let me make sure I mean, part of what my understanding a little bit about the environment has a role to play in the evolution of humanity. So people of color are, you say people of color are aggressive, but not as aggressive. Now, because of the environment, with it being a tropical environment, with food being plentiful.
More plentiful, yeah. Yeah, this is partly it. Yes, the only major group of mankind to develop in a glacial environment in a harsh climate were the Caucasians. The rest of the people were more or less tropical. And they didn't have to have these glacial these glacial adaptations to let them survive in a glacial environment because they didn't live in a glacial environment. And those adaptations sort of covered over aggression, displacement adaptations that everybody else had. And so the Caucasians ended up more aggressive, more expansive.
Now, what is that term again? You said aggressive displacement?
Aggression displacement mechanisms. That's what they're called in the anthropological trade.
And that means specifically what?
Well, it means physical adaptations designed to make pleasure to absorb aggression. Like if your skin is more smooth, or if your sex organs are larger, then you get more fun out of sex. Your aggression, if you have it, is more likely to be absorbed. If your skin is hairier, it's not as sensitive. If your sex organs are smaller, they don't give you the satisfaction. This is a classic comic version, you understand. But that's basically it.
So
the old 60s phrase, make love, not war, is more applicable to other groups of humanity than to Caucasians. They can't do it. They have to make war.
Now, before I continue any further, can you just give us, the listening audience, your particular background? Are you a black man, a white man, a native man, a yellow man? What's your history or heritage?
I'm a southern redneck white.
A southern redneck white.
I was born in Talladega, Alabama, which means buzzard's roost.
And now, how can you talk about white people or let these particular things be known about white aggression, being a white person yourself?
Okay, it all started rather in 1954 in Jackson, Mississippi. At that time, my parents and I was 10 years old, I think, at the time, were supporting the local drive for what was then called integration. And the Ku Klux Klan decided to, stop all this. So they burnt my house, they bullwhipped me, and then they also killed a couple of kids in the black ghetto then. And I said to myself, why? Why is this senseless horror going on? And I decided to devote my life back then to finding out why any human beings would act toward other human beings this way. I'm going to devote my life was bleeding and yelling. She was upset. The house had been burnt down. My back was bleeding. And saying, okay, I'm going to devote my life to this. It was 10 more years before I could get around to it. I was only 10 years old then. But I made the commitment then, 1954, Jackson, Mississippi.
Research? 40 years, otherwise
Sir, with two black...
just because a this tank boy raped a white woman.
Exactly.
And so he deserved to die at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. Full of
of this makes us a human. I don't know when, 1910. No, the first book was the Kronos Complex, published in 1973, which was the foundation for all of this, for all human beings, never mind whatever group or whatever, and what makes us a human being. Then I went to Iceman Inherited, showing that the Caucasians were a little bit different kind of human being. Okay?
Okay.
And then there were other books that sort of enlarged or amplified on that theme. But basically speaking, the first book was the Kronos Complex, trying to decide the difference between all human beings and all other animal species. And then then Iceman Inheritance, which was why the white race was a little bit different from the other races. And then there was Chosen People from the Caucasus, which zeroed in on one group of the Caucasians, which were more aggressive even than most Caucasians.
Get out of here. You mean there's a subset of white people within white people that is more aggressive than all white people?
Absolutely. That's what makes history go around.
Oh, sookie. Now, hey, folks, you are listening to RealBlackTalk.com on the radio. I am your host, Brother R.A. It is straight up 7 o'clock on WMBR Cambridge 88.1. And we are talking with the author of The Iceman Inheritance, The Chosen People from the Caucasus, and the Columbus Conspiracy, Michael Bradley, and we're discussing there is a subset of white people that are more aggressive than all white people. And what subset group or what delineation is this group? How do they designate themselves, Michael?
Well, this was a subset of white people who came from the Caucasus Mountains and the other mountain ranges that go around from it, which was the last refuge of truly glacial people. When the Ice Age ended, these people took refuge in these mountains because those mountains, as they went up in them in altitude, had the same climate that they had been adapted for. So those people, which run from the Caucasus into Europe, and then also into Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and whatever, those people are the most aggressive among the white people because their glacial genes have been diluted less. So they're more aggressive yet than most white people who've mixed around a bit.
Less diluted? What do you mean? Does that mean more inbreeding?
Well, precisely. Most of these people in the group I'm talking about specifically, which are the European Jews, have injunctions against breeding with anybody else, and they can't marry outside their own ethnic group. And so these Neanderthal genes, which came from the Ice Age, they're kept all in the family, they bounce around, they're never diluted. And so the aggression is much more in evidence than it would be otherwise. If this wasn't the case, I mean, if these European Jews interbred with anybody else, then pretty soon they get diluted. But as it stands, no, they perpetuate this aggression by cultural means, by not wanting to intermarry with anybody else. And so they're a little bit more aggressive than your average white bear, and that's it.
Now, Now, I mean, you're a white man saying that the Jews are more aggressive than regular white folks or other white folks, and you're saying that there's more inbreeding amongst Jewish people, but Jewish people, I thought Judaism, I thought that was a religion. I don't understand.
Well, no, neither does anybody else. It's both a religion, and it's also claimed to be an ethnic group.
An ethnic group with a specific religion to inbreed?
Well, that's part of the injunction to it, is don't marry anybody else but a Jew. That's part of it. There's many other injunctions as well.
Now,
here's something I guess you're laboring under the same misconception that most people are laboring under, and that I guess you think that Jews came from the Middle East.
Well, I mean, I know that they commandeered the land.
And that I guess you think that Jews came from the Middle East. Laboring under. And that I guess you think that Jews came from the Middle East.
Well, I mean, I know that they commandeered the land in 1947 with the help of the United States to take away some Palestinian land.
But where did they come from? These were Central European Jews, which are called Ashkenazim, as opposed to biblical Jews, which came from the Caucasus into the Middle East 2,000, 3,000 years before. But in 1947, the people who commandeered that land were Central and Eastern European Jews, and they call themselves Ashkenazim. Now, they're not even related to biblical Jews. None of them come from Abraham. They converted to Judaism in AD 740, or 1,300 years after the Bible was finalized in its present form.
You're dropping some real history up in here, Michael Bradley. I'm like, you're blowing me away here. So Ashkenazi Jews are not related to the Jews referenced in the Bible, descendants of Abraham.
No, they have nothing to do with Abraham.
Who are the Jews of Abraham?
Okay, the Jews of Abraham were Hebrews who came from the Caucasus around 1400, 2000 BC, nobody knows really, and they invaded from the Caucasus down to the Middle East, and they settled among the Egyptians, and they settled among the Palestinians there, and they sort of held out, and they never were exactly killed off, so they persisted. But the Jews we're talking about, who were population of the modern state of Israel, had nothing to do with these people. They were Russian steppe tribesmen called Khazars who were converted to Judaism in AD 740. They had no direct genetic connection with Abraham at all.
Who converted them? How did they convert? I mean, I thought you could only...
Why they converted. It's sort of a funny story. By that time, Islam had conquered a great deal of the world. So what happened was, on one hand, there was the Byzantine Greek, Orthodox Greek Empire, in what's now Turkey. And then right next door in Persia or Iran, there was the Islamic Caliphate. Now, who controlled the balance of power in the Russian steppes, including the Silk Road to China? Well, it was these Khazars. So everybody made huge attempts to convert them to either Christianity or Islam. But some Khazar king, and we only have 3 versions of his name, was smart enough to recognize that if he was converted to either Christianity or Islam, he was going to lose his power as middleman of all this wealth in the steppes. So he knew enough, somehow, to know that Judaism was to some degree, that you might say, the common denominator between Christianity and Islam. So he had his people adopt it en masse, 3 million of them, in AD 740. It gave him a respectable religion. It protected him against conversion by either the Christians or the Muslims, and everybody was happy. At least the Khazars were happy. They maintained their steppe dominance until 1218 AD.
1218 AD. What happened in 1218 AD?
The Mongols came in. and shoved the Khazars, plus the other more minor steppe tribes, Bulgars, Alans, some others, many others, into Central and Eastern Europe, where they were fragmented. They were no longer a nation, but they retained their Judaism. And these are the Central European Jews, or Ashkenazim, of today. And it migrated into North America in the last century, between 1870 and 1920.
So there's a significant distinction, and you just accounted for the history of the Ashkenazi Jew as opposed to
Sephardic Jews.
The Sephardic Jews who are the descendants
They're genuine. Okay, Sephardic Jews, for instance, I'm a Sephardic Jew. You can count your heritage or family back to the actual Holy Land. Ashkenazim Jews never came from the Holy Land. They were Russian steppe tribesmen who adopted or were converted to Judaism 1,300 years after the scriptures were written. They have nothing to do with Abraham.
Okay, so now let's bring that.
Now, so basically it boils down to this. Israel, in a sense, you could call it a double deception. Now, I'm not saying anything more than a lot of very famous Jewish writers have already said, like Arthur Kessler, for instance, of Britain. First of all, the Jews in the Holy Land, the biblical Jews, they never were the majority population of even that place. Now, when they were kicked out or expelled from the Holy Land by the Romans in AD 70, they went mostly to Spain. That's why they're called Sephardic Jews. Sepharad is just a Hebrew name for Spain. So in 1947-48, these people who had converted to Judaism then claimed the Holy Land as their traditional homeland, which of course is nonsense. And the Arabs know that. By the way, the only people who don't know that are North Americans. The Arabs know that. Most of the Jews themselves know that. Every single Jewish rabbi knows this. But it's not something that you're going to read in the newspapers very often.
And, well, we know that most of the newspapers and the media is owned by... Now, which kind of Jews would own the media? Is that the Sephardic Jew or the...
No, it doesn't really matter. In North America, I don't think, except for me, you probably ever talked to a real Jew. In other words, I'm a Sephardic Jew. I can count my heritage or lineage, whatever you want to call it, back to the Holy Land. To give you an idea of the situation, 4.5% of all Jews in the world are Sephardic Jews and can trace their ancestry back to the Holy Land. The other 95.9 or 0.6% of Jews in the world are these Ashkenazim, who were converted to Judaism in AD 740 and have nothing to do, whatever, with Abraham. Those people migrated to the United States very heavily between 1870 and 1920, and most of them stayed in New York originally, then they went to Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, those are the Jews. That's what Americans think of as Jews. I doubt that you've ever met a real Sephardic Jew from the Holy Land.
Well, now, because this is realblacktalk.com, and I know that black folks heavily hold on to Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, and the Jews in the Bible, how do you think it is that black people hold on to Jewish history as their own history, or is it their history?
Well, of course it's not their history. In certain respects it may be, but this is a very complicated question. There were black Jews in Africa, in Egypt, or the Sudan, before there were ever any other kind of Jews there. Because what defines a Jew was, to some degree, not to all degree, stolen from the Egyptians. That is to say, a supreme god, circumcision, all that kind of stuff. The Egyptians were doing that. Now, there were black Egyptians who were doing it before the biblical Hebrews picked that up during the Exodus when they were in Egypt. So some black people, probably a very small percentage, may actually derive from these black Jews that exist in Ethiopia, the Sudan, southern Egypt, from, 1400 BC. But most of them simply adopted the Bible as slaves and really grabbed onto it. Bible as slaves, 1400 BC. But so some black people, probably a very small percentage, may actually derive from these black Jews that exist in Ethiopia, the Sudan, southern Egypt, from, 1400 BC. But most of them simply adopted the Bible as slaves and really grabbed onto it.
Okay, now...
And they're not any more related to Abraham than well, I am related to Abraham, than, say, Menachem Begin. He's not related to Abraham at all.
Okay, now, I mean, we're in the historical arena here, and what I'm looking for is an understanding and a connection. We're talking about the origination
slaves may actually derive from these doing that. Now, there were black Egyptians who were doing it before the biblical Hebrews picked that up during the Exodus when they were in Egypt. So some black people, probably a very small percentage, may actually derive from these black Jews that exist in Ethiopia, the Sudan, southern Egypt, from, 1400 BC. But most of them simply adopted the Bible as slaves and really in Ethiopia, the Sudan, southern Egypt, from, 1400 BC.
You can do that with Armenians and Kurdish Jews. These are Jews who never lived in the Near East, who always stayed in northern Iraq, in these areas, and Jews who never lived in the Near East, who always stayed in northern Iraq, in these areas. And here, again, it's the same colors for both. It's not exactly the same, but you see that Kurdish Jews and Armenians also have the same deep roots. So before Armenians became Armenian and before Jews were Jews, they clearly came from the same part of the world. Again, it's the same colors for both. It's not exactly the same, but you see that Kurdish Jews and Armenians also have the same deep roots. So before Armenians became Armenian and before Jews were Jews, also have the same deep roots. So before Armenians became Armenian and before Jews were Jews, they clearly came from the same. So before Armenians became Armenian and before Jews were Jews, they clearly came from the same part of the world. That's why it's not a surprise that they belong to the same groups. Two more slides to talk about what's the next focus of our research. First, now we're able, through very detailed autosomal that are now.
Epidemic that must have engulfed, you could say, the ancient Middle East, not just the Hittite kingdom, around, or let's say towards the end of the 14th century BC. It probably started around 1320, and according to the main source, it lasted about 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
20 years.
Mm-hmm. We hope that won't happen to us.
Yes.
In the Hittite point of view, whenever something happened in daily life that was out of the ordinary, let's say something very serious like an earthquake, but also an illness of a family member, and kind of everything in between, floods, etc., in the Hittite view, that immediately meant, oh, the gods are punishing us for something. But the gods don't tell you why. What it was that you did in the past that makes them now punish you through a plague, or through this earthquake, or the flood, or the illness. No, it's up to you, the individual Hittite, to find out what it was and which god is angry. Because, as you may know, the Hittites had the proverbial 1,000 gods, which is quite true. If we count about all the names of Hittite gods listed in the Hittite texts, you come very close to 1,000. The Hittites liked to add foreign gods to their pantheon, which is why they ended up with 1,000 gods. So it was up to the humans, to the Hittites, to find out which god was angry, why he or she was angry, and what they could do again to appease the god, to soothe his or her anger, and to restore the balance in life again, to return to the normal situation where you don't have to be afraid of anything.
Many different places at the time. And then, of course, the infamous Black Death, probably after the Corona pandemic, the most famous pandemic now. So the kind of event that happened in the 14th century that probably killed about half of all Europeans. And that's something I will then talk more about in a few minutes. The kind of event that happened in the 14th century that probably killed about half of all Europeans. And that's something I will then talk more about in a few minutes. We're then talking about what we call the, that's interesting, okay, the second epidemiological transition, which is then, of course, the 19th century, where we have the introduction of hygiene, then in the 20th century, antibiotics and vaccination, that really change our focus in medical research away from infectious diseases, because we think they are under control. So there has been medical scientists and actually even historians and other people in the 20th century that said by the end of the 20th century, we will not have infectious diseases anymore in the human population, right? Which was crazy if you think about it now. But back in the day, this was kind of the Heilsbringer, you might say in German, or something like that. So antibiotics were really seen as the kind of Wunderwaffe that will, or historians that are interested to know, what did my skeletons that I excavated die of? So what was the causative agent of that large pandemics that I talked about? Or if I have a mass grave from 5,000 years ago, I want to know what the skeletons that I excavated die of. So what was the causative agent of that large pandemics that I talked about? Or if I have a mass grave from 5,000 years ago, I want to know what these people died of, and we can actually look into that. So we have done a lot of work on Yersinia pestis, and I will talk about some of those studies today, but we also looked at Mycobacterium leprae, so looking at the evolution of the causative agent of leprosy. The oldest ones we now have are in fact from ancient Egyptian mummies that are about 3,000 years old. We also looked at Mycobacterium leprae, so looking at the evolution of the causative agent of leprosy. The oldest ones we now have are in fact from ancient Egyptian mummies that are about 3,000 years old. But some people I know are even working on older material now. We have done a lot of work on Treponema pallidum, which is the causative agent of syphilis, kind of tracing it back to the probably early evolution in the Americas. So it seems to be one of the few pathogens that were actually transported from the Americas to Europe. So it first appears in 1494, related to a ship that came back with Columbus from the Caribbean, and they already then introduced syphilis to Europe. So that went quite fast. And then it spread all over Europe, in fact, killing. So it first appears in 1494, related to a ship that came back with Columbus from the Caribbean, and they already then introduced syphilis to Europe. So that went quite fast.
When you think of pirates, you probably think of rum-guzzling, treasure-hunting, eye-patch-wearing, yar-swearing bad boys of the high seas. But did you know that centuries before Johnny Depp suited up as Jack Sparrow, there were Jews who operated under the swaying Jolly Roger? Who were these Jewish pirates of the Caribbean? What motivated them? And what kind of semi-kosher mayhem did they get into? It all started in 1492, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled 200,000 Jews. This purge of the Jews Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled 200,000 Jews. This purge of the Jews came from a Christian clerk who wanted to stop traditional Jews from influencing conversos, Jews. Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled 200,000 Jews.
Of territory in European spread across. So how did the Indo-European spread across such a vast amount of territory in a relatively short amount of time, given that that territory was inhabited by pre-existing peoples? Hi, I'm Kevin McLean. If you'd like to support the channel, please check out the links below. And a big thanks to my Patreon supporters. So this is something that I've been thinking about and doing some research into over the past while. And of course, part of the reason why the Indo-Europeans were able to spread so effectively is because of their militaristic culture and their mobility, in that they relied a lot on horses, and they were not necessarily originally a fixed population group, so they didn't establish communities that were farming based, so they were able to be highly mobile and move around and move from place to place. And part of it also is to do with this exclusionary culture that they had, where young people, once they could no longer obtain what they required within the community, were cast out from the community and were expected to go form warrior bands for themselves and to go obtain new territories for themselves. And we see this reflected in Roman myth. Were expected to go form warrior bands for themselves and to go obtain new territories for themselves. And we see this reflected in Roman myth, in Celtic myth, and so on. And I've done a video discussing this in some detail, but I will be doing others in the future. Primarily, this method alone would not seem to explain how they were able to conquer so many different peoples in such a short period of time. Now, one advantage that they had was bronze, presumably. It appears that they were the main conveyors of bronze technology into Europe. And one of the reasons why they were not so successful against other established cultures in the Middle East and other main conveyors of bronze technology into Europe. And one of the reasons why they were not so successful against other established cultures in the Middle East and other places is because those cultures also already had advanced civilizations and were able to defend themselves more aptly. But another reason is because in Europe, especially, the Neolithic population seems to have suffered some kind of calamity. There is a population decline, and this Neolithic population seems to have suffered some kind of calamity. There is a population decline, have suffered some kind of calamity. There is a population seems to have suffered some kind of calamity. There is a population decline, and this might even happen. It happens either in tandem with the arrival of Indo-Europeans, or it even happens before they arrive. And it seems that this population decline was linked to the spread of disease, possibly the bubonic plague, or the disease, possibly the bubonic plague, or the Y. pestis, which is actually caused by fleas. And so this seems to correlate to the exact time, or slightly earlier, than the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. Now, excavations, then the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, the exact time, or slightly earlier, than the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. Now, excavations and studies of Indo-European genetics have shown that the steppe peoples were also affected by this plague, but they had also developed some kind of immunity to it,
So, the Black Death. Pretty exclusively a back then thing, right? But if you're descended from the European, Middle Eastern, and North African populations that experienced the plague, and you're dealing with an autoimmune disease, for you it could be a right now kind of thing. That's because evidence is emerging that gene variants that were beneficial as one of history's worst plagues was killing off millions, well, those variants aren't so hot now. So here's how the Black Death and other plagues wrote themselves into our genes, and why that turned out to be such a double-edged sword. So let's start with a brief history lesson. History's most notable outbreak of bubonic plague, aka the Black Death, happened in Europe in the 14th century. It's thought that a ship arrived in Sicily with rats already infected with the causative agent of the plague, Yersinia pestis, and the rats quickly spread the disease all across Europe. Victims often died within a week, and the death toll quickly rose to over 25 million people. In a 2022 article from the journal Nature, an international team of researchers hypothesized that with a death toll that high, this likely acted as a gigantic natural selection event, where the survivors likely had some genetic advantage over those who died. And to investigate this, they did what any good research team would. They went grave robbing, or more appropriately, grave sampling. Working with museums who had access to a handful of cemeteries, the researchers were able to get DNA samples from several hundred people who died before, during, or after the plague. Notably, however, these grave sites were from London and Denmark, so even though the Black Death ravaged the Middle East and North Africa as well, this study focused only on Europeans. Their goal was to see if there were specific gene variants that were more common in the surviving population than in the pre-plague population, to find those plague please spare me varieties. As a quick refresher, many genes come in multiple flavors that can have slightly different effects. The same gene might come in regular, diet, or cherry vanilla, and we call those variants or alleles of that gene. Of all 20,000-ish genes in the human genome, the researchers focused on a pool of about 400 immune-related genes, which admittedly is still a lot of genes, but now they could analyze these few hundred genes to find ones whose frequency changed significantly pre to post-plague, and specifically ones that became more common, since that would mean they had some protective effect. All of this narrowing down left them with 4 sections of DNA that likely helped the survivors, well, survive. And one gene in particular sparked their curiosity. They identified 2 versions of a gene called ERAP2, one that seemed to end up expressing a lot more of that gene's product, and so presumably doing more work than the other. And when the team dug a little deeper, they did indeed find that these 2 flavors of ERAP had a difference in how they functioned. One variant produced an A type of ERAP2, which coded for full-length healthy proteins. The other was associated with a B type of ERAP2, which produced protein products that cut off too soon, causing the cell to degrade them. So rest in pieces, ERAP2 type B proteins. Research has already shown that ERAP2 is important for helping to train other immune cells, clearing pathogens, and modulating inflammatory responses. Knowing that, the researchers hypothesized that the type A variant leads to more ERAP2 protein and thus better immune training. Essentially, the variant would have helped the immune system more efficiently identify plague bacteria while also limiting inflammation. The scientists estimate that people who had 2 copies of the type A variant were 40% more likely to survive the plague. That's a pretty huge advantage considering how it wiped out nearly half of Europeans. But while this might sound like a win for all of humanity, that's not the full story, because that same protective version of ERAP2 has also been associated with something else: Crohn's disease. We don't know exactly how it's involved, but it might be that immune training function going a bit too paranoid. And when you back up to that bracket of 4 variants the researchers had originally identified as protective against the plague, a different one is associated with autoimmune diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So our genetic superheroes are suddenly looking more like double agents. The vigilant immune variants that kept the plague bacterium in check are a little too trigger happy and turning on our own bodies. And this isn't unique to the genes identified in this study. It's a well-documented phenomenon known as antagonistic pleiotropy. Pleiotropy means that a gene has more than a single effect, and the word antagonistic highlights how these effects may be at odds with each other. So the ERAP2 type A variant would be an example of antagonistic pleiotropy. It may spare you from the plague only to harm your descendants with an autoimmune disease. A study done in 2023 sought to discover how much antagonistic pleiotropy has affected us. They surmised that this double-edged sword might be more common than we previously thought, creating an evolutionary trade-off between infectious disease protection on the one hand and autoimmunity on the other. And they did this by looking at 10,000 years of genomic data. When examining all this data, a trend appeared. The more fit our genes became in protecting us against infectious diseases, the more vulnerable we became to autoimmune diseases. They could even identify specific variants, such as one that increases the risk of inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, while decreasing the risk of infection with noroviruses, or a separate one that is associated with protection against COVID-19 instead, while also increasing the risk of IBD. with protection against COVID-19 instead, while also increasing the risk of IBD. And the researchers don't think this is a coincidence. They tried to pinpoint when selective pressures started favoring these genetic variants, and they found that most of these changes have occurred since the start of the Bronze Age, around 4,500 years ago. These changes have occurred since the start of the Bronze Age, around 4,500 years ago, depending on the region. This was a time when people were coming together to live in cities, traveling more, and depending on the region. This was a time when people were coming together to live in cities, traveling more, and raising more livestock. All of this would have exposed people to more pathogens, which led to selection for these infectious disease protective traits that just so happen to increase vulnerability to chronic diseases. Plus, this link does make sense. When faced with infectious diseases, we might want a strong immune response, something that ERAP2 helps with in various immune cells when exposed to the Black Death. But when that immune response gets too strong, it can end up harming us, like with Crohn's disease, which means a very, very long history of disease and survival is written into our DNA.
This is the story of the deadliest infectious disease of all time. It's been with us for 3 million years, since before humans were Homo sapiens. We have evidence of it in the mummies of ancient Egypt, and it's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. We have made extraordinary medical advances. Vaccines, antibiotics, and clean water have saved millions of lives. And yet, despite that, in 2022, this disease killed more people than malaria, typhoid, cholera, homicide, and war combined. It has gone by many names. In ancient China, it was known as Waifu, meaning destroyed palace. In ancient Hebrew, Shakafeth, meaning wasting away. The 19th century term, consumption, for the way it seemed to consume the body. Today, we call it tuberculosis. But tuberculosis is more than just a disease. It reveals fundamental truths about who we are as human beings and how we have changed or failed to change throughout history. We're powerful enough to light the world at night, to artificially refrigerate food, to reshape the balance of gases in the atmosphere. And we've even identified the cure to TB. So why are so many people still dying of it? I've always found it strange that in studying history, we tend to focus so little on disease. Something like 90% of people die of disease, a phenomenon so entrenched in human life that we describe many such deaths as natural causes. And yet, if you attend a college survey on the history of humans, you will learn more of wars and empires and trade routes than of microbes. As Virginia Woolf wrote in On Being Ill, it is strange indeed that illness has not taken its place with love, battle, and jealousy among the prime themes of literature. Or, put another way, Hamlet never gets a headache, but the rest of us do. I suspect that we want to imagine we choose our fate, that human history is largely the story of human choice. Like, perhaps that's why rumors swirled that Alexander the Great died of poisoning, even though he almost certainly died of typhoid or malaria. We simply don't want a world where even the world's most successful emperor can be felled by mere infection. And yet that is the world we live in, a world where disease shapes history in profound ways.
And then it spread all over Europe, in fact, killing millions of people. We have also done a lot of work on microbiome tuberculosis evolution. This was actually quite a fun project because we looked at tuberculosis before Columbus in the Americas, and the modern Native American populations all have European tuberculosis, so that was introduced after the Spaniards came there. So it was the question, was tuberculosis there before? And paleopathologists that looked at skeletons, they told us, yes, it was there, because you can actually see it in the bones. People had tuberculosis more than 1,000 years ago, and we wanted to know what kind of tuberculosis, so we extracted then DNA from those ancient skeletons that were more than 1,000 years old, from Peru, for example. What we found surprisingly was not European tuberculosis, was not African tuberculosis, was not Asian tuberculosis, it was actually seal tuberculosis. So it was a zoonosis. It was actually a type of tuberculosis which is called Mycobacterium pinnipedii, that you today find in the southern hemispheres, like in Argentina or Chile, Australia, New Zealand, in seals. And it's present all through the southern hemisphere, and it probably was then taken up by a human population because there's a lot of seal hunting on the especially western coast of South America, and there probably it was then entered the human population. We could even then show over the last couple of years that it spread then in human populations, so in people that were not in contact with seals. So that was then again even giving rise to this type of tuberculosis in North America. And we've done a lot of work on Salmonella enterica, so the causative agent of typhoid fever. There we found that this was brought, one of those diseases, from Europe by the Spaniards to the Americas, and actually caused some large outbreaks in the 16th century, something that's called the Cocolitzli. So there was a large pandemic happening in Mexico in the 1540s. Killing millions of people. As you might know, about 90% of the Native American population died within the first 100 years of contact, most of them probably due to infectious diseases. And we could actually really see how this spread during that time. And what we could also do over the last couple of years with a postdoc of mine, Felix Kai, who is now at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, was to look at the evolution of this pathogen over 7,000 years, to see from actually a wild pathogen was present in animal population and rarely picked up by hunter-gatherers to become a human-adapted pathogen that by now is called paratyphi C, that is only found in humans, so not anymore in any animal population. And in between it was actually in domestic livestock, so it could really like track the whole evolution from 7,000 years ago from the wild to this pathogen that then became human adaptive. And then we also had the fantastic opportunity to work with this fellow. You might know who he is. He's the Ötzi, the Iceman. And here we had this wonderful situation that he had a frozen stomach when he was discovered. That was actually frozen from more than 5,000 years ago. And together with the group in Bolzano, we could actually actually also Ben Kiyokauza, who's here in Kiel, we could extract DNA from the stomach, and we could reconstruct entire genomes of Helicobacter pylori, look into the evolution of Helicobacter pylori over the last 5,000 years, which was also very exciting because it was very different to what people had expected to be present 5,000 years ago. Emerging here in Southeast Asia, so maybe if we have more data from Southeast Asia, but how it then survived them to actually here in the past, those close relations are all co-infections. So they had one strain and they had another. They found that all those people were individual. So then we're curious, how did it do it then? Those people have HIV, those people probably didn't have HIV, but when we looked closer, we actually found that all those people were co-infected with another HBV strain. So all the ones where we found that strain here in the past, those close relations are all co-infections. So they had one strain and they had another strain. So this strain only entered in co-infected states. And then today, again, immunocompromised people can be found. But what's most striking, and we still don't have a good answer, is all those strains that are just normal strains that don't need a co-infection or anything like that, they got extinct. And this is the only one that survived, the one that cannot infect by itself. So it's really almost a mystery. But part of that, why it cannot infect, is also that the proteins that are needed for infection are actually the ones that cause the immune system to actually act on the HBV. So the way kind of basically to escape the immune system for a long time might have just been to not have those proteins, but how it then survived for 6,000 or 7,000 years, we still don't know. So it's quite a mystery, and hopefully it was actually re-emerging here in Southeast Asia. So maybe if we have more data from Southeast Asia, we actually see the different kind of stages in between those 7,000 years. So it's really quite a remarkable finding that I just wanted to mention. But I wanted to talk about plague, and I already are 20 minutes in or so sorry for that. But I really want to come back to Yersinia pestis now, because I find it also a fascinating case of kind of looking into the evolution of a pathogen over longer time periods. So first, a few words about plague itself. Plague is actually not a good example of a human-adapted disease because it is just not adapted to humans. It's adapted to rodents. You find it in wild rodent populations all over the world. And the way how it gets transmitted is actually a very nifty mechanism. That the vector that transmits the disease is actually a flea. How does he do that? The flea takes with a blood meal bacteria up into its stomach, and then here in the proventricular, in the kind of prostomach, if you want, those bacteria start to build a biofilm that actually causes a blockage of the gut. So next time the flea is biting, it cannot swallow blood. It has to spit it out again, and in that moment it has to basically become in contact with the biofilm. So bacteria are in the spit, and by that it basically transmits the bacteria into the next bite wound. These can then jump to humans, cause also infection. Bacteria enter the lymph system, usually go to the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes become big and swollen. That's what's called the bubo. So this is why we call it bubonic plague, because the lymph node just becomes big. Again, a lot of people, which is, for example, that fact the reasons it's making to groups and might every host will be too late. So it's a serious, I think, threat. It's found again today everywhere in the world. Most of the diversity of the pathogen as well as the hosts is actually found in Central Asia, where we think it probably evolved. But you can actually find it in all continents today. There has been recent outbreaks that some of you might have followed in Madagascar in 2017, for example, but it's also found, for example, in the United States. So if you go to the Grand Canyon, there are actually warning signs. You shouldn't pet the squirrels because they can, in fact, infect you with Yersinia pestis. So it's really found all over the world. But the strain that is found everywhere outside this region here is the same strain. It's actually a branch 1 that probably disseminated in the 19th century and basically then established it all over the world. I already mentioned some of the historical events that we now know have been caused by Yersinia pestis. So the so-called first pandemic that started in the mid-6th century, which lasted about 250 years. Then magically it disappears. We don't know why it disappears, but it does magically disappear, like Donald Trump wanted Corona to disappear. So something happens here. We're not quite sure what. What we've seen recently was that when we looked at rat genomics, also together here with Ben, we looked at the diversity of rats, and we could actually see that around that time you have a genetic turnover in rats. So the black rat population in Central Europe gets replaced by another black rat population, which could mean that there was some sort of bottleneck. So maybe something happens in rats and that's why they disappear, but that's just one hypothesis. We are not quite sure. It does, though, come back with a Black Death then in the mid-14th century here. Again, it lasts for several hundred years. We have about 7,000 outbreaks of plague until the 18th century, and then again,
first-degree relatives, maybe, let's say, siblings, or maybe, parent offspring, or let's say father with a daughter, or maybe siblings. Whenever the combination, what is interesting is that this is pretty unusual in many human societies. I mean, it has been recorded in historical times. For instance, in ancient Egypt, it's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with 2 of his daughters, and this with 2 of his daughters.
Formed by the lower part of that little design there, and then the rest of it would go up to the north. So the Hittites were right in the middle of a great deal of trade, and a huge amount of commerce was more or less flowing through that region. The history of the Hittites is known to some degree. A lot of it remains obscure, but we know that there were 2 periods in which they were of somewhat significant importance in the ancient world. One is called the Old Hittite Kingdom. It looks something like this. This is Turkey and the region that was controlled by them. This would be from 1680 down to about 1590. This, of course, is much earlier than the Exodus, much earlier than our present interest, but this would be the time of the patriarchs. 680 is roughly the time that Joseph was in Egypt and so on. It's before the events that we've been looking at since then. So that's the earlier period, there were several obscure kings. The most prominent of them was the last of them, a guy named Merchili. He is the one who did this sudden attack down the Euphrates and wiped out the Babylonians in 1595. If you were in this class a few weeks ago, we talked about how the old Babylonian Empire was attacked suddenly and more or less wiped out in a kind of surprise assault on them in 1595. This is the guy that did it. He went right down the Euphrates and attacked them and then went home and died. And Babylon was just left vacant, and so a group that lived at Mari, which is about halfway up the Euphrates, if you can see it on that map, a group that were Indo-European actually, took over, and that became what's called the Kassite rulers of Babylon. We'll talk a little bit about that at a later time. But anyway, this is the guy, the Hittite ruler that did that. But from that point on, the Hittites kind of lapsed into obscurity. We don't hear much about them. No certainly historical documents of any great significance until a somewhat later time, which is called the Hittite Empire. This starts about 1450 and goes down to about 1100 and is, of course, the period of time that we would associate with the era of the judges. And so we're more interested in this for the moment. There's several kings. I'll just note these kind of in passing here briefly. The first one is Tudalius. Sometime around 1450, he's reigning in the Hittite Empire. Now, the number 1450 should be significant to you. What great event takes place generally in the time frame of about 1450 in the Old Testament? The answer is the Exodus. Right? Very good. I have 8 students on the front row here. Who had been reigning in Egypt up until 1450? Harder question. Thutmose III. Remember him? He's the guy that ran Moses out of Egypt. When Hatshepsut died, remember 30 years earlier, political winds change, Moses has to take off, and he does. Thutmose III was a brilliant military strategist, and he had pushed the boundaries of Egypt north through the region that we would call Canaan, and was actually pressing up against Hittite areas. Tudalius is the Hittite king who said enough of this, and he began to push back. And that's the main thing we know. So he is kind of the one who is answering that initial pressure from Egypt to reach up and establish imperial presence that far north. So he begins to rebuild Hittite power at this time when it had been rather dormant now for some time. The main thing that he's remembered for is freeing a city called Aleppo from Egypt in 1450. This map will try to show you that. Aleppo is the circled city up to the north. Kadesh is to the south. That's the region where this conflict was going on, and that's his main claim to fame. He pushes back the Egyptians and forces them to kind of retreat from these claims that they had made. What's going on with God's people at this time? The Exodus takes place in 1447. The conquest of Canaan is largely about 7 years or so toward the end of that century. The death of Joshua, 1375. The period of the judges, as we said earlier, about 1350 to 1050. So this is kind of connecting some of those dots for us. The next king, guy with the favorite name here, Suppiluliuma, 1360 to 1320. We alluded to him last week. So this is a little bit of review. This is now just at the beginning of the period of the judges. Suppiluliuma was concerned about, first of all, the Mitanni. We've talked about them. He pushes them off to the east and kind of gets them out of the way. He installs 3 sons to form a kind of buffer state to protect him from the Assyrians and the Mitanni and so on. And then he begins to push southward. And this is where we mentioned him last week. He wants to push Hittite control into this region coming down the coast of the Mediterranean. There's all kinds of trade advantages for doing something like that. The Apiru, we mentioned last week, were at the same time pushing north. Akhenaten is the Egyptian king at this time. We talked
got married. It's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with two of his daughters.
Talked about him a little bit last week. Akhenaten is the pushing north. Akhenaten is the Egyptian king at this time. We talked about him a little bit last week. He's getting distress calls from his allies in Phoenicia. This is review, but review is good. And so the Phoenicians are trying to reach Akhenaten, appealing for help because they're in a squeeze play between these two groups, the Hittites, which are pressing down from the north, and this group that is called the Apiru, which are pushing up from the south. And of course, we were suggesting last week that there's been a fair amount of scholarly speculation, at least, that these who are called the Apiru are actually associated with an ancient group that we know of as the Hebrews. And if that's the case, it would correlate perfectly with the period of the Judges. By now, about 1350 and later, the Jewish population there is indeed pushing the borders, pressing north and in other directions as well. And so it may be that the Phoenicians were feeling the pressure from both ends, and that seems to have been taking place in tandem with this pressure from the Hittite king Suppiluliuma. In any event, Akhenaten ignored those appeals for help. We talked about that a little bit last week. Another little detail about Suppiluliuma that's interesting. You recall that Akhenaten dies in 1334, then you have a very brief reign by a fairly obscure pharaoh, and then that's followed by Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun rules 9 years until 1325. He dies as a young man, probably only about 20 years old. He leaves his widow, a young princess, Akhenaten. Try saying that. Akhenaten is her name. And she's in the middle of international geopolitical pressure, wondering what to do. She's just lost her husband, Tutankhamun, and she's looking for someone to kind of bolster her position and her ability to stay in a position of rule. And she actually appeals to the Hittites to send a Hittite prince to marry her and become the next pharaoh of Egypt.
That must have been tough to say, who is it that I offended? Which of these 1,000 gods? Presumably you had maybe nature gods or war gods that you could maybe eliminate, 500 or eliminate 250 gods and concentrate on the other 750.
But I don't think it is so much for them figuring out which group of gods or to eliminate groups of gods. I think it prompted them mostly to first search in their conscience. What did I do wrong? But one more thing that made it difficult is that it doesn't have to be you. It can also have been your family, your predecessors, your father, for example, as we will see today later on. It could be basically anything, but you would have to search your conscience, and then probably the God would follow from that. For example, in the big plague that we have a lot of information on with the Hittites, so Mursili first had to go back to his conscience and dig in his past to see what it was that might have set off the god's anger. One of the things, for example, was one of the storm gods, as the Hittites called them. The Hittites had violated a treaty with the Egyptians. The treaty was, as they saw it, imposed on them by the storm god. So if they violated the treaty, then it was most likely the storm god who was angry. And now they had a number of storm gods, but this was the highest storm god, the storm god of the Hittite lands, the land of Hatti. So I think once they had found for themselves something that, this I have done wrong, then I think the god might follow quickly.
I see.
Most of the information on this comes from what we call a series of plague prayers that Mursili, the Hittite king who reigned during this plague, had spoken or spoke to the gods, or had spoken through other people, through his priests, for example. In those prayers, he is kind of desperate. So this is the introduction to what we call the second plague prayer. And Morshili is very emotional. He comes right in because the gods know what he's talking about. Morshili knows what he is talking about. He is at the end of his tether. He doesn't know what to do anymore. So he says, "Storm god of Hatti, my lord, and gods of Hatti, my lords, what have you done? You have allowed a plague into Hatti land, and Hatti land has been very heavily oppressed by this plague. In the time of my father, Shuppiluliuma, and my brother, people have started to die. And even now that I, Morshili, have become a priest to the gods, that is, I became a king, people continue to die into my days. And this is now the 20th year that dying continues in Hatti land. And still, the plague has not lifted from Hatti land. I cannot overcome the agony in my heart, nor can I overcome any longer the anguish in my body." And he then tells the gods how he tried everything. He went to every conceivable deity, every conceivable temple. He prayed, he probably gave offerings and gifts, conducted oracle investigations to find out what it was that the gods expected him to do to end the plague. And yet, still, it's now been 20 years and nothing has happened. So he's really quite desperate.
And he's thinking, it's got to be this treaty breaking.
Right, as one of the reasons, because in the end he comes up with three main reasons that he sees, that he identifies. And it's also very interesting how he says that he sent his people, his scribes, into the royal tablet collection, and he told them, search for possible reasons, give me anything that I can work with. And so the first thing that he identifies as a possible cause is offerings to the river, to the god of the river Euphrates, which is on the eastern border of the Hittite kingdom. So, and he tells that apparently former kings used to annually bring offerings to the river Euphrates, the river Mala, as he calls it. But then he apparently realizes that since the beginning of his father's reign, this famous king Shuppiluliuma, it has not happened. Kings have discontinued that offering. So that's number one. So the deity of the river Mala, the river Euphrates, may be angry. The second reason is what you just referred to, this border dispute with Egypt. Now, the border with Egypt. Now, the border with Egypt was not in Egypt as we might imagine it. No, there was Egypt controlled a lot of the Levantine area, so that's nowadays Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And sort of in Syria, there was a border between Egyptian-controlled territory and Hittite-controlled territory. And at one point, the Hittites had made incursions into the Egyptian-controlled territory of Syria. And by doing so, they violated an earlier treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians, and that, according to Morshili, could have been the second reason for the gods' anger, because at the end of a treaty, the Hittites always list a whole host of gods by whom they swear, or to whom they swear that they will abide by the stipulations of the treaty. And usually also there is a blessing formula and a curse formula. A blessing formula saying that if both parties to the treaty stick to the stipulations of the treaty, they will be happy forever. But if they don't, and this is the curse formula, then may the gods destroy them. And so this is what Morshili now thinks. He says, wait a minute, or actually my father, invaded the Egyptian-controlled territory in Syria. By doing so, we violated the treaty, and now the gods, and especially the storm god, who imposed the treaty on them, is coming back at us. And note that the gods, well, they may have started the plague right towards the end of Shupurluma's reign, but the brunt of the plague falls on Morshli the son, who he doesn't stop saying had nothing to do with the whole thing. It was all his father, but okay. So that's the second reason that Morshli identifies. And then the third reason is Shupurluma, his father, came to the throne very likely in a not very regular way. It is very likely that there was a young king preceding him who hardly figures in our texts, to whom people had sworn their loyalty, and yet he was murdered. And that is how Shupurluma came to the throne. And although Morshli doesn't say it explicitly, he clearly suggests that his father was very much implicated in the murder of his predecessor. And so that's the third reason, the murder of this young predecessor, and how Shupurluma, his father, came to the throne. So, and note how all three reasons are attributed to his father. It was these offerings to the river Mala, the river Euphrates, that his father discontinued. There is this treaty which his father violated, and there is this murder in which his father, again, was implicated. So Morshli says, explicitly also says, I had nothing to do with this. It was all my father.
And of course, the gods instantly then stopped the plague and said, we understand.
Yeah, you'd wish. Or more. No, not at all. Because as we talked about, this lasted for 20 years, well into or almost covering most of Morshli's own reign.
Well, do we have any idea of what the numbers were? I mean, it's 20 years, so I imagine it's huge, like the numbers that the plague affected or the deaths. Do we have any archaeological or historical record of how many people it affected or what the scale of this was, in spite of its length?
No, not really. I think archaeological, I can't think of anything. As far as the texts are concerned, Morshli just says that a lot of people see what the, by which know, at least if it's being kind of really affecting everybody in society. At least that's kind of the feeling that it gives me. And for often,
it sounds like there's a lot of blame throwing, and or be humble in the presence of the gods.
You are right, oh gods, it's true, we did it. That ultimate story didn't sin at all. And yes, one and Jews say him to this kind of put principle, as we just saw with the literal scapegoat or scape ram, to convenient to the king. He sends another person, and that one will take care of the ritual. It's one of those prosaic little jewels that you find often in Hittite texts. Okay, so what does the king then say to this prisoner who is now dressed in royal garments? If some god of the enemy land has caused this plague, for him I have hereby given an adorned, a fully dressed man as a substitute. This one, this prisoner, is now great with respect to his head. This one is great with respect to his heart. And this one is great with respect to his penis. You, O God, be satisfied with this all dressed up man. turn again, please, in friendship to the king, the commanders, the army, and to the entire land of Hatti, and let this prisoner bear the plague and carry it back into the land of the enemy. So it's the same principle as we just saw with the literal scapegoat or scape ram, where they kind of put the curse that they formerly felt being on themselves, they put it here in the form of the king's garments on somebody of that country, and then they chase him back into enemy country and hope that he will free them from the plague and bring the plague back to the enemy.
But most of them simply adopted the Bible as slaves and really grabbed onto it.
Magically, it disappears. Here we have some better ideas. Probably, again, it's related to rats, because what actually happens in the beginning of the 18th century is that the rat that you might know, if you've ever seen a rat on the street somewhere, it was probably not the rat that caused the bubonic plague or transmitted at the time. It was probably a brown rat. Rattus norvegicus, called Wanderratte in German. And that actually einwandern, so it actually comes to Europe at that time, so in the beginning of the 18th century, and replaces the black rat, which was the rat that transmitted the plague. It's quite aggressive, the brown rat towards the black rat. So wherever there are black rats and brown rats come in, black rats disappear. In fact, the black rat in Germany is on the red list. Yeah? So that rat that actually caused the plague back in the day is actually now endangered. So maybe because of the brown rat, so that sometimes when people find rats disgusting, is that they might have saved us from the plague, right? So at least that's one hypothesis. And then in the 19th century, there's another emergence of plague, this time not in Europe, but in East Asia. I just mentioned it's found all over the world. This is because of the third pandemic starts in Hong Kong, and then through steamships and shipwrecks, which is also black rats, it gets then transmitted all over the world, and that's where we find it everywhere. This is also the time when actually Pasteur sends this nice gentleman here to Hong Kong to do research on this kind of enigmatic outbreak there. Alexander Yersin, he finds out that there is this kind of transmission of this bacteria, and that fleas and rodents are probably involved. It gets then also named after him, and this is then since when we know the bacterium itself. And the first work that we did then some years ago, that I in fact presented 19 years ago already, was working on the Black Death, because at the time we were not sure what has caused the Black Death. It was debated. Some people said it was a virus, some people said it was a bacterium, some people said it was an unknown disease. So there was much speculation. So we went out and started to work on a collection from the so-called East Smithfield, which is a cemetery in London, where all the people from that cemetery died during the Black Death. You do my back to you find in the world today. And then we could do some, if you want, family history of Yersinia pestis. We could then see how is the genome from the Black Death related to Yersinia pestis you find in the world today. And this is the family tree of Yersinia pestis. So those are the major 4 branches that are found in the world today, with about 80% of all the strains. And then there's some earlier strains that branch off early on time. And they all come from this common ancestor called Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, or it has a common ancestor with Yersinia tuberculosis. In fact, it actually falls into the diversity of Yersinia tuberculosis. So then the first question was, how is the Black Death related to modern strains? What we found, maybe not a big surprise, back then it does fall here. It falls very much close to the base of the diversification of the main 4 strains that are found in the world today. This is in fact the one you find all over the world that probably caused the third pandemic. So it falls very close here, and in fact, it is the most recent common ancestor of the strains that are found here, meaning that it doesn't have a derived position. It doesn't have a position in its genome that only is found in the Black Death, but is not found in the daughter lineages. So all the daughter lineages from this branch one go back to the Black Death. So it really kind of basically was the mother of this strain here, which is interesting because it means that it's basically still around, right? Because you have then everything, all this diversity that comes out of that node here that is found in the Grand Canyon or Madagascar, or Central Asia and China and Oceania, it all goes back to this common ancestor here. And it doesn't have anything special. So based on its biology, you can't really say it has a special gene, it's kind of maybe more higher mortality or something like that, because that would have then meant convergent evolution, that this gene got lost in all lineages if it's not found today anymore. From that point, we wanted to go further, and what we then did over the, last couple of years, it will come in a minute, is that we looked, you can see all over Europe, into many different outbreaks, mass graves, all kind of individuals that we could then get Yersinia pestis from, to reconstruct what happened after the Black Death. And this was work that was largely done by Maria Spirou, who did a PhD and a postdoc with me back in the day. So she looked at Yersinia pestis then through time, so did a little bit of time travel. Starting with the Black Death, she had then one genome that came from a site in Eastern Europe that was very close to the site where it was first recorded in the past. This is a site called Laichevo, and surprisingly what you found was that it was basal to the Black Death. It was one mutation away from the causative agent here of the Black Death, so it was just down basically here in its evolutionary history. And this is interesting because I just said, it was first recorded in the East, in Eastern Europe, and it has moved from the East into the West. And this is supported by this strain here because it is really one mutation less than kind of this Black Death event here. She also then had a number of individuals from the Black Death, so from the actual outbreak, which was all over Europe, again, killing millions of people. And where do they fall in the phylogeny? You might see it or not see it. You see this kind of red dot popping up here. So the ones from Spain, the ones from France, the ones from England, the ones from Germany, we now have about 30 of them. They're 100% identical. All of them. In their complete genome, 4.2 million positions. Not a single mutation during the Black Death. 5-year pandemic, killing 50 million people, no microevolution whatsoever, right? Which is amazing if you think about it. Like during Corona, we have all this microevolution, all those strains, alpha, beta, gamma, you name it. Not during the Black Death. It was introduced, one strain introduced, radiated, killed millions of people, didn't evolve. When we calculate the mutation rate of Yersinia pestis over a long time, we get one mutation per 10 years. This is a 5-year period. Makes sense. There shouldn't be a mutation, but that was also then what we saw. So it is actually quite interesting. We then have later outbreaks, which are in the late 14th century, and they have then some mutations, like 3 here, 1 there. So it's not a lot, but some mutations towards this strains. And in fact, we now have many on this kind of branch here that fall a bit like pearls on a chain towards this branch 1. So we see a lot of microevolution. Now this is in Europe, this is in Europe, this is in Europe. There are more here. They're all in Europe, giving rise to this thing which causes the third pandemic in the 19th century. It seems that the microevolution leading to this branch, in fact, happened in Europe. So that not just the second pandemic, but also the third pandemic actually started here, but many years before it actually then spread in the 19th century. We also have a large branch that comes out of the Black Death, which is all the recorded then outbreaks, the thousands of ones that happened then after the Black Death, where we have genomes from so far, they're all coming out of the Black Death. So really the Black Death was this kind of radiation event in Europe, where you have a lot of diversity getting born, but completely lost. None of them survived because it's gone. It's not there in Europe anymore, right? It disappeared in the 18th century. And in the late stages of its evolution, it's also quite interesting because in those late genomes here, we have some loss of virulence genes. So it seems to lose virulence through time, which is something that people have proposed for pathogens for a long time. So if a pathogen gets introduced, sometimes it kind of burns out, it loses virulence because it's actually not good if it kills. It might be better if it doesn't kill as fast to get kind of disseminated better. And we do see this kind of evolution here towards the loss of virulence, which is interesting because the same thing happens in the same region in the genome 800 years earlier during the Justinianic plague. The same regions get lost, completely independent on a different lineage, right? So this is really convergent evolution during the end of the pandemic, so maybe even then somehow being related, but that's pretty much speculation here. So for the Black Death, we have the dispersal model now, pretty good understanding. 14th century, like historical records suggest, it seems to enter then Central Europe, remains here for hundreds of years. It doesn't get reintroduced. There were a lot of people, researchers in our field, that said it gets reintroduced. It comes from Central Asia again, and it comes, and there are waves after waves from Central Asia. But no, it's here. It's actually here for 400 years. It doesn't leave. It does leave, though, in this one strain that later on causes the large pandemic, but it doesn't enter again. So it really seems to be basically present throughout the entire time period. One other big question then for us was, can we trace back its origin? Can we actually say, where did it come from? It is first recorded here in Kaffa, in Crimea, but where did it kind of come from? The oldest genomes that we have from here, but people have suggested it came from the Caucasus, some people from Central Asia, some people from East Asia, some people from Northeastern Asia and so forth. There were many hypotheses where it was. And we have been very, very lucky to work with this person here, a historian called Phil Slavin, because he looked at a very kind of special site for plague researchers that is called Karadizhakh, which is close to Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan. And this is a unique site because this is a site from the 14th century where we have gravestones in some old Syriac language that say this person, with the name of that person, died in 1338 on pestilence, right? Which is fantastic because it kind of gives us the date when the person died, the name we don't care too much about, but that the person died of pestilence. So it's a lead to look into those skeletons, what they might have, maybe the pathogen that might have been present in them. So we collected skeletons, and what's also interesting about them is if you actually look at the tombstones, you see that there's a big event here. 120 out of the 460 tombstones are all from the year 1338, really indicating there was some sort of outbreak during that time, right? So again, Maria worked on this material. She extracted genomes in 7 of them. She could actually see evidence. 3 were enough to get whole genomes. How do they look like? We could reconstruct them. Where do they fall in the phylogeny? Look at that tree. You might already kind of expect where they fall. They fall exactly here. They're actually the most recent common ancestor of all the 4 major branches that are found in the world today. So this is literally now the most recent common ancestor of those 4 branches that we now know is from 1338. Black Death starts in 1346.
Jews. This purge of the Jews. It all started in 1492, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled 200,000 Jews.
Black Death, as it was known, was only the opening, if the most serious episode, in which not only silk and other Asian products could travel, but also rats and fleas, aided by the cooler climate in the 14th century. Then there was the opening of the Straits of Gibraltar to trade, following the ending of Islamic control at the end of the 13th century, enabling the disease to spread to northwest Europe as well. Bubonic plague is actually brought to the Crimea in 1346 from the Caucasus by a Mongol army, one of many trying to establish their power following the breakup of Genghis Khan's empire. The army was devastated by the plague and had to retreat, but the disease affected local inhabitants and was carried by ship to Constantinople and thence following seaborne trading routes to the rest of the Mediterranean and beyond. This is then the famous Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. And the best known medieval description of the symptoms is by the Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron features stories told to each other by a group of people fleeing from the city of Florence after plague has broken out there in 1348. And Boccaccio wrote, its earliest symptom, in men and women alike, was the appearance of certain swellings in the groin or armpit, some of which were egg-shaped, while others were roughly the size of the common apple. Within a short time, they would appear at random all over the body. Later on, he writes, the symptoms of the disease changed. Many people began to find dark blotches and bruises on their arms, thighs, and other parts of the body. In most cases, death occurred within 3 days from the appearance of the symptoms we have described. The majority, he says, without any fever or other complications. Unlike other Italians, Boccaccio had no doubt that the plague, as he wrote, had originated some years earlier in the East, where it had claimed countless lives before it unhappily spread westward, growing in strength as it swept relentlessly on from one place to the next. And here you have a rough map of the spread of bubonic plague. The shades as we're getting lighter, less red, less brown, red, and more yellow, green as it moves onwards from the east, going westward and then coming back around. By 1348, it's in London. It moves from London to Oslo, then Ireland, Germany, reaches the Danube in 1349, Scotland and Sweden in 1350, Poland in 1351, Kiev in 1352, and Muscovy the following year, 1353. By this time, it had more or less run its course in the rest of Europe. And the devastation of the Black Death was enormous. Recent estimates have put the number of dead across Europe at 50 million out of a total population of 80 million, or more than half the entire population. The local impact is often even more severe. There have been some local studies, let me just quote a few of them. The number of households in Chambéry in France fell from 403 in 1348 to 184. The pestis was present in all of them, albeit in different strains. DNA testing of skeletons from a variety of plague burial sites in Europe, which has found definitively, I think, that Yersinia pestis was present in all of them, albeit in different strains, indicating that it found its way from China to Europe around 600 BC along a variety of routes. Just because some of the symptoms described in ancient or medieval sources were different from those exhibited by the disease today doesn't mean, in other words, that it wasn't what we can call bubonic plague. Well, the first pandemic, that is global or almost global series of linked epidemics of the same disease that can be described as bubonic plague with any degree of plausibility, is that generally known as the Plague of Justinian, sweeping across the Roman Empire and its former territories in the West from 541 to 767 AD, or if you prefer, in the Common Era, in a series of 15 great waves. It was described by the chronicler Procopius, who wrote in 752 AD of what he called a plague that threatens to annihilate the human race. And let me quote his description at some length. It started, he wrote, from the Egyptians who dwell in Pelusium.
So this is basically the mother of the Black Death, if you want, right? So of that strain that then radiates in Western Europe later. So that was very exciting. What's also interesting is that we have in the marmot population in the same region here, so this is where the site was, we have strains that are found in those marmots here. And in fact, the blue strain here is the closest related one to this diversification event here, also to the star, to this one. So still today in the vicinity, you have the closest living relative of that strain, which is really remarkable. So meaning that it was basically around there for 700 years. And then somewhere there, then jumped into the human population or into commensals that were living in close proximity with humans, and then spread to Europe. So 8 years later, again, causing the Black Death. Another question that we had now for the last 7 or 8 years was, this is the historical pandemics. What happened before? Was plague already around? You have seen that tree. You have had now for the last 7 or 8 years was, this is the historical pandemics. What happened before? Was plague already around? You have seen that tree. You have that big diversification event, but what happened in the past of that? So we did a lot of metagenomics, we did a lot of screening for pathogens over time. We and also other colleagues, also Ben here, for example, also the Copenhagen group, they did a lot of work on that. And we actually found that plague was pretty common already in prehistory. The oldest plague genomes now we have are more than 5,000 years old, and you can actually see them from all over Eurasia. So this is something that we now call the late Neolithic Bronze Age plague, because that's the time period when it was spreading during that time. And what's really interesting about that type of plague that we have from this time is that if you look at the genome, there's actually a whole chunk missing. It actually lacks some of the key genes that are necessary for the flea transmission. This pathogen could not have been transmitted by fleas, right? So not being able to cause, therefore, bubonic plague. So the question then is, how was it transmitted between people? One idea is pneumonic plague, possibly. It was certainly found in the blood, because otherwise we wouldn't find it in those skeletons in really high amounts, so it caused some sort of sepsis. How did it enter? We are not sure. Some people also think it's gastrointestinal. It's possible. We see that in Salmonella enterica. We don't really know, but it was a different pathogen. To really understand how it worked, we would have to reconstruct it, which we're not planning to do, especially not after the last 3 years. I think this would be a very bad idea. But otherwise, I think it will be very hard for us to really understand how this transmission mechanism worked in the past. So there's a lot of open question about it because it's extinct today. This lineage is not found anywhere in the world today. So it's in the phylogeny. It's basically a lineage that branches off 5,500 years ago. There's also some earlier lineages here that Ben and his group here described, and that kind of are basically cul-de-sac. So they're all extinct. This one is the one that we find over 3,000 years, first entering the human population about 5,000 years ago. It's a very enigmatic pathogen because it evolves in a very strange way. And I have a lot of expertise on evolutionary scientists in the room. It evolves like a virus. So what happens here is, and this is just an older kind of analysis here from 2018, we now have about 40 genomes from this pathogen, and they evolve like pearls on a chain. So you have one pathogen that gets replaced by another one, that gets replaced by another one, that gets replaced by another one, that gets replaced like another one, and that goes on for 3,000 years. You never have two parallel lineages. There's always one strain that gets replaced by another strain, gets replaced by another strain, that are all connected through a backbone. But the backbone basically is one, because it's not two branches, it's one branch over 3,000 years. It's really remarkable. It's a bit like the flu evolves in some ways. But the backbone basically is one, because it's not two branches, it's one branch over 3,000 years. It's really remarkable. It's a bit like the flu evolves in some ways, where you have a new strain that evolves somewhere that replaces the previous strain, or like Corona evolved. You had the alpha that replaced by the beta or gamma or Omicron and so forth. It behaves like that, but in a very, very systematic way. We have genomes almost every 100 years now, and it's a bacterium. It's not a virus. So it's really hard to come up with this being all positive selection through higher virulence or something like that. So the best explanation we currently have is it has a tiny population size, which is somewhere in Eurasia. There's somewhere a place where it resides for 3,000 years. And every couple of decades or so, it emerges, spreads all over Eurasia. Bacterium, it's not a virus. So it's really hard to come up with this being all positive selection through higher virulence or something like that. So the best explanation we currently have is it has a tiny population size, which is somewhere in Eurasia. There's somewhere a place where it resides for 3,000 years. And every couple of decades or so, it emerges, spreads all over Eurasia, because we have strains like from Estonia that have the closest relative in the Altai. So it is highly mobile. It moves all over Eurasia in short time, but that then it completely collapses and then it re-emerges again. And that over 3,000 years. It's really enigmatic. If anyone has an idea, look for me during dinner, right? Because it's really something we haven't really understood. What we do have, though, are now a whole bunch of genomes from about 4,000 to 3,000 years ago that in the phylogeny fall here. They actually fall basal to the modern day variation, but actually in the middle of it, because some earlier strains of Yersinia pestis are still around the world today, branch off before that. So there is Yersinia pestis about 3,800 years ago, like we know it. If you look at the genome, the green ones here, they have all the genes necessary for fleet transmission. So they are already bubonic plague as we know it, which is about 4,000 years old. So it evolved sometime between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. With in fact, all the genes that are necessary for the fleet transmission, they all evolve in this short time period. So by 4,000 years ago, we have Yersinia pestis as we know it. 5,000 years ago, we don't. So it's a relatively short time period for a relatively complex mechanism to evolve and then not change much at all. So it's not that we see major genomic changes in the last 4,000 years. What we do see is a massive increase in effective population size during that time. So basically it evolves and then it becomes super successful, probably because of rodent species that get infected. And then of course there are huge populations. So it makes a lot of sense that it spreads then during that time. Now I want to summarize. So what did I talk about? The causative agent of Yersinia pestis has at least caused 3 historical pandemics that people kind of assume to be caused by Yersinia pestis. This is something that is pretty much established now. I didn't talk about the Justinianic plague that much, but we have a lot of genomes now from that time period, and they all indicate that this was also a plague.
Then it divided and moved in one direction towards Alexandria and the rest of Egypt. And in the other direction, it came to Palestine on the borders of Egypt. And from there, it spread over the whole world, as he meant the known world known to him, always moving forward and traveling at times favorable to it. And he says this disease always took its start from the coast and from there went up to the interior. People had a sudden fever, some when just roused from sleep, others while walking about, and others while otherwise engaged without any regard to what they were doing. And the body showed no signs of change from its previous color, nor was it hot, as might be expected when attacked by a fever. In 527, it had become emperor. Justinian's plague spread, or sneezing. Justinian's plague spread, not least because Justinian, who had become emperor in 527, succeeded in reconquering many of the lost territories of the former empire, taking North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Goths, and bringing Spain under Byzantine control once more. Political unity in the Mediterranean brought wider regions into trading with Byzantium, especially in the Middle East. By the same token, the massive mortality caused by the plague is generally agreed to have been around 30% of the population of the towns and cities affected, brought a halt to the expansion of the empire by leaving fields untilled, taxes unpaid,